Hello everyone, Lore Master of Sotek here, and boy howdy do we have a lot of news to go over today. Sadly, me and Italian recorded our podcast yesterday, which has proven to be a mistake, because all of the news dropped today. But, so we're just going to have to do it with just us. Of course, we'll talk about it next week on the podcast. With the amount of news coming out, we're almost certainly going to meet next week. But I wanted to talk about this today because, it's out and it's fresh and it's interesting. So, for those of you who haven't already seen it, I'll be posting the links at everything that I'm looking at in the description down below, so you can go check it out for yourself. But the Total War Creative Assembly has gone ahead and put out the new content release news, essentially. So this is basically just them announcing everything they're working on. And I'm not going to talk about the historical stuff because if you're a frequent on my channel, you probably don't really care, and I don't really care. So we're just going to focus on what we're here for, which is fantasy. Historical stuff is cool, neat, great, but, there are other places that are better to check out that kind of information who, maybe have a better context for it. I don't care. I don't have enough time to play historical Total War games with the amount of fantasy that's coming out these days. So we're just going to stick to what we do. So anyway, let's talk about the fantasy new content team. So these are the guys that work specifically on Warhammer 2 DLC. And here they kind of just announce everything that happened this past week. They talked about that they updated the dwarves. They gave us the Bone Giant. The Queen of the Crone released. And then they announced that they're going to be doing a public beta this week to fix some of the issues in the patch notes, which is going to be public. So that's actually really interesting. Normally, I think they have their own teams that test the patches before we get them, but it looks like they're going to be opening up to the public for this week, which is pretty awesome. So all of y'all be sure to keep your eyes out for that. I'll make an announcement when that's live, that way we can all contribute, to try and make the game as good as possible. And they can hopefully fix little things like, obviously Hellebron's sword is one of the biggest things that needs to be fixed. I've seen numerous bugs that I've reported on various forums. And, little things like, making the Bone Giant a construct, and just a couple little knickknacks here and there. So be sure to play the game a lot if you're out there and you have the game. Playing a lot right now is good to try and find bugs, because this will be a good chance for us as a community to report them and be able to get them fixed. Then here's the big bomb that they're dropping, which is what's next. They say what we can say is that we're working on the next campaign pack for Total War Warhammer 2, but it's a little while off yet. So this news is not only immensely important, but very surprising to me. Because I was one of the people who did not really think that Warhammer 2 had space or material enough to viably release another campaign pack. Which I believe, I'm going to double check this. I heard Dov say this on his video, but I'm going to double check just because I don't trust anyone in this universe, and it's always good to double check your own sources. So let's go to the Total War Twitter, because apparently they clarified what a campaign pack is. Okay, so the Tomb Kings was a campaign pack. Alright, so that means we're going to be getting a brand new race with 4 legendary lords, a full roster, and a unique, playable campaign. The difference apparently between the race packs and the campaign packs is that the race packs seem to have been focused, the old race packs, is that they apparently focus more on having a mini campaign, which seemed to be the crucial element, or something like that. But regardless, so this is going to be something along the lines of the Tomb Kings, which, for all of us, I hope, realize that the Tomb Kings was a phenomenally successful release. It was very well done. It had tons of content. It's super fun to play. All of the campaigns were interesting for all 4 legendary lords, and it was with the addition of the Bone Giant, it's basically a fully complete roster. Like, the only thing it's missing is it could use another lord, like the Lich High Priest, or the High Lich Priest. just to give it a magic lord. But other than that, like, it's done. Like, there's really not that much left you could do to the Tomb Kings to make it better than it already is. So, in light of that, this is really interesting, because it means there's a significant race coming. So, of course, everyone in the world is going to want to know, who is it? And I'm sure a lot of people are going to come to me on streams and ask about it. So I'm going to go ahead and address it here, but, you know, my opinion will be evolving and changing as we get more news and information. So, looking at all the possible options, we're looking at either a completely brand new race, or we're looking at a sub-race. So I'm basically going to start on the likely side, and we're just going to go until we reach the absolute insane nonsense. But here's the restrictions to this game. For this campaign pack to be a viable option, it has to be present on the Vortex campaign map, because this DLC is for Warhammer 2, which means, so, you know, obviously it'll play into Mortal Empires, but don't look at Mortal Empires as your template. So, like, Kislev is not an option, because Kislev is not on the map, it's nowhere near the map, and it just wouldn't make sense. So Kislev is, like, an absolute no. But let's start with the most likely options. So when we look at completely new races, there are, the only real options in the likely side of things are humans. Arabi, for instance. Arabi does, and we'll just kind of go through them one at a time. So first, let's start with Arabi. Arabi is, of course, the Arabic equivalent in Warhammer Fantasy. They have a very interesting culture. They live out in the desert. They own quite a bit of land on that coast. They're mainly positioned on that coast where Archon the Black roughly starts, due to the fact that, you know, everything east of that was basically wiped out by the Tomb Kings. And the Arabi has a lot of really interesting characters and weapons associated with it. You know, obviously they fight with scimitars, and they have, if I recall correctly, I think they have camel cavalry, based on a lot of historical things. One of the things they're most noted for is that they tend to associate, they're kind of more okay with associating with demons than their northern humans are. They're noted to make pacts with demons, and that kind of ties back to when the Sultan Jafar was in charge of Arabi. He made horrible pacts with all sorts of terrible powers, like the Skaven and the Demons of Chaos, and some of that has kind of lingered into modern-day Arabi, where Tzeentch actually has a prominent position in some in kind of Arabi's shadowy culture. But, you know, Arabi isn't an evil country. It's just different. They also, of course, have jinns, you know, things like elemental spirits and genies of a sort, which are basically creatures that are just pure magic that that manifest a physical form and are sustainable in Arabi. And the Arabians have managed to harness them pretty well. You see a lot of, like when they released the Dreadfleet expansion for Warhammer Fantasy, which Dreadfleet was a ship-based naval combat game, board game, that had like massive ships that represented different countries and cultures. One of them was Arabian. It was a Arabi themed ship, and it had a sorcerer on it who, his big gimmick for his ship was that he would summon these 3 powerful elementals that had different effects. He would summon a water elemental, a fire elemental, and a wind elemental that had different abilities that he could use to buff his ship. And then, of course, being an Arabian, he had a ton of money, and he hired an ogre crew. So he had a very nasty ship. But so that's Arabi. However, when we look at why Arabi might not work, there's one significantly large problem with Arabi. And that is that it's not that big of space between... You have the Tomb Kings and Archon the Black right there. And then you have the Bretonnian factions right there. And the Bretonnian factions are actually very important. And the reason is because when Bretonnia was updated a few months ago, they received an expanded technology tree where they basically doubled it in size. And one of the techs that they added that was really meant to bring Bretonnia into Mortal Empires was they got a significant bonus to confederating with the southern Bretonian factions, the Crusaders, basically. And in this most recent patch, the Crusader Bretonian factions are actually very survivable and very durable. And I think that's because they are literally put there and designed so that Bretonnia has a basically, like, you're encouraged to go there as Bretonnia and fight those wars. Now, so if we take all those into mind, that leaves very little space where you could actually put a new faction in Arabi without them having to, like, completely move Archon the Black, for instance. Because I believe he starts in the Wizard Caliph palaces, which obviously is an Arabian settlement. So things don't look great for Arabi on that sense. Plus, I think in kind of today's world, Arabi is not the most culturally sensitive of factions, especially since they were kind of the big bad guys for a lot of Warhammer history. So I don't know if they could, if they were brought back, they would have to be majorly reinterpreted. And I don't know if Games Workshop would want to really allow CA to do that. Because at the end of the day, you have to remember that everything CA does has to get signed off by Games Workshop. Which clearly Games Workshop is fairly lenient, because we've seen some kind of crazy things. But they don't have infinite leniency. And I think making a Arabi-focused faction would probably be pushing too far for the way Games Workshop kind of is currently crafting their image. So we go to some other likely options. Another one that I've heard a lot about, and actually does seem very strong, is the Southern Realms. Which, for those of you who don't know, the Southern Realms is basically all the human factions that are not Bretonnian, Kislev, or the Empire. They're everybody south of that. So, your Border Princes, Thalia, Estalia, Sartosa, and Sudenburg. And the reason they're really strong is because of a few things. And they seem like the most likely, to be quite frank, and cut to the point. One, when you're playing on the Vortex campaign, and you open up your Diplomacy tab, if you scroll down to where the human factions are, they're labeled as the Southern Realms. They're not labeled as the Empire, even though they use Imperial rosters, or any of that. They're literally just called the Southern Realms, which is the New World Colonies, Sudenburg, it's all, and Sartosa. Also, we know that Thalia is very important in the game's coding. Thalia is I believe it's a 10-slot city. It is the most powerful of the AI factions, with the exception of Kislev, and it has a lot of unique techs associated with it. For instance, if you play Norska, you literally have a tech tree that's just designed for taking on Thalia, which seems to heavily suggest that they're supposed to be an important faction. They have and Dov mentioned this in his video as well, in that the other thing about these techs is that it's not, whenever you get a tech against a specific race, it'll give you bonuses against that race. So, like, if you take the Vampire Counts tech, it'll say, like, whenever you fight Vampire Counts, gain +6 leadership, yada yada. But for the Thailian one, interestingly enough, it doesn't say gain these buffs against humans, or gain these buffs against the Southern Realms, or what have you. It's specifically against Thalia, which is really interesting, and might be a red herring. That being said, and Thalia does have a lot of strong points in that, for instance, if the Southern Realms were to become playable, Sartosa very recently was upgraded to be a much more significantly important settlement in the game. It has 2 unique structures available on it, and it is right off the coast of Thalia in the Mortal Empires campaign. So if you were to play a Southern Realms campaign for the Vortex, you could feasibly start off as Sartosa, or one of those random human empires, but Sartosa would be kind of an interesting starting position. Or in Mortal Empires, you could start in Thalia, and then you'd conquer all of Thalia, you'd conquer Sartosa, you'd conquer Astalia and the Border Princes, and you'd be the powerful realm of the South, and that would actually be really interesting because it would give the Greenskins kind of something more interesting, or it would actually give the Greenskins and the vampires something to prevent them from getting grotesquely oversized when they devour those lands. And it would also hopefully make Skavenblight more interesting as well, and be more of a threat to the average player. That being said, one of the things working against Thalia is that it doesn't really have a centralized roster. Thalia and the Southern Realms are kind of a mishmash of different cultures around the Warhammer world. And they don't really... A lot of them don't have an iconic leader or lord or... like, you have little things from the Dogs of War, who we'll talk about in a minute. Like the occasional famous character and the occasional famous regiment, and you had like Talayan pikemen, and they have a very weak presence. Obviously, that's not a huge deal because I would have said the same thing about Norska, but we have Norska and they have a great roster. Granted, a lot of it is bolstered thanks to its monstrous additions, but if they were to focus a human faction from the Southern Realms, I would hope to see some probably like crazy inventions and things like that. But it would probably be much more human focused, like Bretonnia and the Empire are. The human realms in the Warhammer Fantasy Universe just don't have a lot of strong associations with monsters unless they're evil, typically. So they are who I think is the most likely. I think the Southern Realms is the most likely choice for a new race. Now, moving on from races in the most likely category, let's talk about sub-races. So the most famous sub-races that are on the map that could be made into a fully playable faction are, of course, the Vampire Coast, which everybody is talking about already. And the Vampire Coast is in Lustria. It would make sense as a feature location because it is a very unique settlement on the entire Vortex campaign. It's really the only true vampiric settlement on the map. You obviously have the Necrarch Brotherhood, and I think the Strigoi Empire doesn't even exist on the map anymore. I think it's just the Necrarchs. But, the Necrarchs aren't a real faction. They're kind of there just to kind of be an early annoyance, but they get wiped out very quickly. The Vampire Coast is the only one that's clearly designed to last, and it's very far away from any of the other faction starting points. I mean, even if the Lizardman and Skaven DLC came out and you put a Lizardman player in Itza, it's still kind of a journey to get to the Vampire Coast, who are fairly isolated, and so it does bode well for a starting position. And Luther Harkin, who is the leader of the Vampire Coast, even though he's not currently in the game, that also kind of seems to lean towards favoring that. And that if Luther Harkin... Here's what I would say about that. If they intended the Vampire Coast to never be playable, then it makes no sense for them to have put the Vampire Coast in the game, but not have Luther Harkin as the Lord. Which he's not right now. It's this random guy who's literally just super random. They could have done what they did with the Red Duke. They could have just put him in there as a generic model like they did with Gorfang and Rotgut, but they didn't. They deliberately left him out, and that was a deliberate decision, which to me seems to suggest that he has a future as a playable character who will come in and be unique and all that crazy stuff. Because otherwise they would have just put him in the game. So when it comes to sub-factions, the Vampire Coast seems very likely as a possibility. Now, I don't know if a sub-faction like that would constitute as a campaign pack, because the Tomb Kings are a campaign pack, but they're a unique race. But I don't think a campaign pack necessarily means it's a new race. That being said, it would be kind of bizarre to get another Vampire Count feature, just because the vampires are so heavily featured. But honestly, if it was a feature that gave us access to like the final little tidbits we were missing from the Vampire Counts roster, and maybe a unique looking faction, I really hope if they do the Vampire Coast, they don't like invent a bunch of crazy new shit for them. Like if I see shooting vampire count units, I'm gonna smack somebody, because that just completely is against their style, and their lore in the way they function. I swear to God, if I see a zombie with a black powder weapon, I'm going to strangle someone, unless the only thing he's using it for is to club people. It just breaks the way the world is designed and its rules. I know there's a lot of Total War players who just don't give a shit about Warhammer Fantasy lore, and they just want what they think would be fun and powerful, but no. But anyway, so the Vampire Coast seems likely there. Things working against them, we already have a ton of vampires. And bringing more vampires into the game as a paid DLC would be very interesting, especially if it was for Warhammer 2. That would be very bizarre. Like, I could almost see the Vampire Coast as a free DLC update, but as an actual DLC, it would have to be something insane, because they would have to be so different from the regular vampire counts that you could sell them individually without it feeling like you're cheating the people who bought the first game. You know, unless it was something like if you own the first game, you get a discount, a significant discount, because then you're only paying for the new stuff. But I don't know. So that's a possible option, though, because of the fact that they exist in Game 1, it seems bizarre as a DLC. But you never know. Other sub-factions that are on the map that are on the map, not necessarily as a race, but they have locations on the map. There's, of course, the Amazons. The Amazons are a race of warrior women who are descendants from the first Norskins that arrived on Lustria, so they're descendants of Lost Ericsson. They are not a crazy mystical alien race. That is a fan book that someone made. That being said, the Amazons are very powerful, and they are very scary. And Games Workshop and Creative Assembly lately have been hitting pretty heavily on diversifying rosters in their games. And by that I mean like having more women, having more people of different cultures and colors and such, to try and make the game more approachable for more people and give them something to relate to, which I think is great. And the Amazons could be a really interesting way to do that. The Amazons, although they're descended from Norskins, they do live in Lustria, so you'd have this culture of these terrifying warrior women who are very skilled with spears. They've, of course, mastered their own beasts of the jungle. They have very different creatures than the lizardmen do. I don't think if I remember right, they don't have much in the way of dinosaurs, but I think they might have had something like jungle cats and the birds you would find in the Colchian Plains and all sorts of other things. And they were, of course, very prominent hunters with javelins, and they're very scary. They have a very interesting relationship with the lizardmen as well, because they're one of the few races that the lizardmen kind of tolerate, because the Amazons they avoid sacred places. So, like, places that are very important to the lizardmen that they guard, the Amazons just stay away from those. Which has kind of allowed them to have a symbiotic relationship. They're not really big enemies or anything. However, the thing working against that, of course, is that Amazons would need a wildly expanded roster to make their race playable, and they might even have to go through some pretty drastic lore changes to make them an appropriate full functioning race. But I would be really interested to see Amazons personally. When a lot of people kind of come to me about it, I always kind of like, I'd rather finish what we have. But seeing as we have a campaign pack already confirmed and it's not a Lord pack, that means that they've already committed to making something new. So if I had to pick something new, like completely new, Amazons is not a bad choice in my opinion. Outside of that, now those are the most likely things. I think the Vampire Coast, the Amazons, Southern Realms, and Arabi are kind of in the pot of realistic options. I think everything outside of that is which we're going to talk about. We're going to be getting kind of into the realm of weird. So feel free to. I'd love to hear which of those 4 you guys think is the most likely, or which you'd like to see. I'd love to see your thoughts in the comment section. Like, which of those would you rather see? Why would you rather see them? Like, I know Luther Harkin would be exciting for a lot of people because we would finally have a vampire count who's not a von Karstein line. We would have a blood, he's a blood dragon. So that would be really cool. Yeah, we have the Red Duke, but the Red Duke's kind of a weird descendant of the blood dragon line. And if he's even part of the blood dragon line, I'm pretty sure he is. But there's almost some weird suggestion that he might be of one of the 2 mystery lines, because there are 7 vampiric lines, 2 of which are unknown. He might be a descendant of one of those. I'm still reading his book right now. I think he's a blood dragon, but it doesn't really matter. In any event, so a lot of people would be excited for that. I think a race of all badass warrior women and just having like a almost pure female human faction would be appealing for a lot of people. I think, of course, the Southern Realms, I know, is a very popular desire for many, 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 many people. And then there's, of course, the Arabians, who could be a really fun mix of a human and kind of elemental spirits faction, which a lot of people might like. Plus, with all the Arabic influence, that could bring a whole nother community that would be really excited and want to enjoy that. So I'd love to know which of those 4 you think is the most likely, or why you'd rather see them, what you'd be most excited for. So, now let's move on to the less likely crowd. So I want to talk about the people who technically exist and are technically an option, but I'm pretty sure they're dead on arrival. The first of those is the Pygmies. So in Warhammer Fantasy, there is a race of people who live in Lustria called the Pygmies. And as you would understand from their name, they are a small diminutive folk who live in the jungle. But what makes them completely not viable is that they are some of the most racist caricatures of black people I've ever seen in my life. They're old models. Terrible. Games Workshop, I think, likes to very much pretend they never existed. They kind of had nods to them, just like the Amazons did in the old Warhammer Lizardman books, and they could potentially be updated to the modern world's standards and maybe be a cool faction, but I just don't think CA or Total War wants to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I think there's too much. I think that was a product of its time, and that's where it needs to stay. So that is something that could exist, but let's just slap it off the table. The next is the Dogs of War. I've seen a lot of people talk about the Dogs of War, and I will continue to stomp my foot down and say it's not gonna happen. Stop trying to make it happen. Pulling a Regina George here. Because here's the thing about the Dogs of War. The Dogs of War are not a race. They're not a faction. The Dogs of War stands for a type, essentially just stands for mercenaries. It literally just means mercenaries. And what the Dogs of War are is they are a collection of different groups from all across the planet who are mercenaries, and they were put into a single book just for the ease of you not having to buy every single White Dwarf magazine. You can't make them work as an army, because you're literally talking about having a Truthsayer with 2 giants following him around from Albion, teaming up with Kislevites that have the Tsar Boris and all this other crazy stuff, teaming up with a undead guy who has a horde of undead following him of all these different races, to a skink who rides on a horned one, Tichi Huichi's raiders, to a to long-drawn slayer pirates, to the halfling fighting cocks, and these super bizarre people from all these different races and creeds that would never work together. That is what the Dogs of War is. And you weren't really meant to take them as an army, though you could, just because Games Workshop liked to give people the ability to choose back then. And they didn't really care that much about the goofiness of it. Right now, a lot of people care about the goofiness. The goofiness died in 7th edition, which is why the Dogs of War got completely phased out. And a lot of these ancient heroes of the Dogs of War, or villains, were completely scrubbed. Like, it wasn't even like they became mentions in other books. Like, they were literally scrubbed out of existence and no longer were real. I don't think CA or Games Workshop, especially Games Workshop, wants anything to do with the Dogs of War. I don't think they want them coming back. I don't think they want them being mentioned. I think they just want them to stay dead. Plus, the Dogs of War are already in the game. That's what the rogue armies are. Nearly all of the rogue armies are based on a Dogs of War regiment. Which you'll click on them and you'll see like Bernhardt's mercenaries or whatever they're called, and you'll meet most of the famous Dog of War units, or at least their army based off of them in the rogue armies, which is honestly the best and most interesting way to put them into the game. I don't think they could function though as a playable race, because it would be madness. Like, where would they start? Who the hell would be their leader? How the hell would you recruit units for them? Like, it would literally be a faction where every single unit was a regiment of renown, which would just be bonkers. And if you can't tell, I hate the Dogs of War. They're part of an era in Warhammer Fantasy that I didn't like, when the game took itself a little too lazily and just didn't care about making an interesting universe. It literally just threw crap at the wall and saw what stuck. And a lot of that was cleaned up for 7th and 8th edition, which are the editions that, of course, I fell in love with and that this game is based off of. So, I just don't see the Dogs of War working. I know a lot of people want them, but I think if you're wanting something along the lines of the Dogs of War, what you're actually wanting is the Southern Realms. Now, it could be that you're one of those people that's like, well, I want the rogue armies as playable, and, if that's what you want, that's what you want. I think you're ridiculous, but, I can't change your heart. But those are the big ones that I think are just don't even bother with them. There's no way they're going to happen. And then there's what I call the crazy category. There is a Hail Mary race that a lot of people don't talk about that exists in Warhammer Fantasy. And when I say Hail Mary, I mean you're standing at one end zone and you're throwing the ball to the other end zone. You're doing a 100-yard throw here, trying to score a touchdown for this race. And for this campaign pack, there is technically one other race that exists in Warhammer Fantasy, technically, who could theoretically be made into a playable race. And the only reason I'm even bothering to bring them up is because of what's been happening in Age of Sigmar, because of the fact that this is a campaign pack and they reference the Tomb Kings, which were a completely new race into the game, and because they would work very, very well on the Vortex map due to the way it's designed. And that is the Fish People. So for those of you who are not aware, there is an entire race of aquatic creatures in the Warhammer Fantasy universe that are a legit empire. They're not like some disorganized mass. They're not like beastmen. They have a legit civilization and culture to them of some type. We know so little about them that it's dumb. I could read through probably every single book from 6th, 7th, and 8th edition, and I could probably gather about somewhere between 3 to 5 pages, like single space page, single space full of text page on this race. Like 3 to 5 pages tops. And this race, basically what they would do is they just swim around the ocean, and they have, of course, a very strong kinship and relationship with all the massive sea creatures, and they would target ships and attack them. And here's what little we know about them. We know that they are not nice and they're not good. They might not be evil, like they're not chaos aligned. They're probably more like greenskins, where they're just very, very destructive and violent and hungry. And what they do is they attack ships with like a Kraken or Black Leviathan or what have you, and then these creatures will crawl aboard, and what we know about them is that they're bipedal, so they look vaguely humanoid, but they have mouths that are just full of needle-like teeth, and they just devour people. And they have been encountered by many races. The Dark Elves have fought them many, many times. The Norskins have fought them. The High Elves have fought them. The Lizardmen really don't like them. Basically, if you go out to sea, these things are a threat. And if you live on the coast, these things are a threat. And they tend to inhabit places that have fallen into the sea, which in your mind you might be like, well, where's that? And the answer is, you might be surprised. Black arcs that have sunk have been inhabited by them. A lot of parts of Ulthuan that was sunk beneath the waves during the Sundering have been inhabited by them. And we know one of the most prominent places that you could actually find, like, I don't know if I'd call it their capital, but a place where we know there's a ton of them is Chup-Yodel, which is a Lizardman temple city that was on the coast. And something happened, I don't remember exactly what caused it, but there was a cataclysmic quake that caused a tsunami. And and Chup-Yodel was so horribly ravaged that everyone in the city was slain. They tried evacuating the city, but the wave was so intense and so massive, when it hit the coast of Lustria, it killed everyone. Even though they tried evacuating, there was nowhere to go. There was no way to get away from it. And it flattened the land around Chup-Yodel and literally broke off that piece of the continent. And it sunk beneath the waves. And the last thing we know about it is that there's a fish people empire that lives in Chup-Yodel as one of their most major cities. That is the Hail Mary race. I think they would be fascinating if they could design them. You know, they'd probably be similar in some ways to the Idoneth Deepkin that we see in Age of Sigmar. You know, a bunch of creatures that tend to prefer the aquatics but can come on land and attack. You know, some of them would probably be blind due to living in the deep ocean. And of course you could have all manners of horrific sea creatures. There was a lot of speculation in 8th edition that race was going to become playable. And the reason is that the 8th edition Big Red Book, also known as the Core Rulebook, had a section with all the special rules in the game listed, so you could look them up for quick reference. And one of them was a brand new rule called Sea Monster. And the Sea Monster rule specifically stated that any creature that had this rule could, it would have all these fun, crazy bonuses when it fought in a water feature, like a river or a lake, but if it traveled on land, it moved at half speed. That rule, despite being included in the core rulebook, was never used. Ever. In 8th edition. It was never applied to a single creature. Even the Charybdis, which is a deep sea monster that the Dark Elves use, it doesn't have that rule because it has feet. It's designed to walk on land. It's just a deep sea monster that drags around black arcs and such. And it's creepy looking, and you know, it doesn't have eyes and has all those big leech mouths, but it doesn't actually have the sea monster rule. So that rule was clearly intended for something. Games Workshop was ready to create something that had that rule, and they never did it. And a lot of people, myself included, believe that there was a deep sea race intended to be released in 8th edition as the new race, just like the Ogre Kingdoms were released for Warhammer Fantasy in 6th edition. But because of how Warhammer was selling and the people who were in charge of Games Workshop at the time, they decided to cancel those plans and started making plans for the End Times, which occurred many years later. Because many of us know that the End Times was a long time in the coming. You know, the End Times took years to prepare for. And I honestly think that race was one of the things we would have seen if they did not go with the End Times. But I've rambled on quite long enough about this particular subject. I want to move on to some Age of Sigmar news that I'm very excited about. You know what? This video is already long enough, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stop this video and put it out. And then we will talk about the Soul Wars announcement, which is the new Age of Sigmar news, tomorrow. That'll work better. The last thing to talk about today, of course, is that Warhammer 3 has officially begun pre-production. That's what this announcement is. We've been waiting to hear some news. but they finally are announcing that Warhammer 3 has just begun pre-production. So this thing's easily a year away, if not more, which is good for Warhammer 2 because that means we've got plenty more content to come. But for those of you who are interested, like myself, we now know for sure that Warhammer 3 has started development. And based on them going to dark places and not returning with their minds and souls intact, seems that the Darklands and the Realm of Chaos, probably the Realm of Chaos in particular, are going to feature very heavily in Game 3. So we'll have to wait and see more. Warhammer 3 should be the darkest of the three, because every single race in it is either a villain or a neutral race. There are no good guys confirmed for Game 3 so far. So with that, I've talked way too much. I hope you guys enjoyed the speculative chat, if nothing else. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the description down below, whether it's about the 4 most likely options, the, I think, 2 or 3 middle options, or the Hail Mary race, as I call them. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys around. Bye.